Vietnam War. The first major offensive of the war, launched by the communist-backed North Vietnamese, was the Tet Offensive. In terms of people lost, the attack was a failure, although the Tet Offensive greatly damaged American morale. Towards the end of Johnson's presidency, the manner in which he handled the war had greatly damaged his approval ratings. Two new popular candidates, Robert Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy, had emerged in the Democratic Party. 6 months into the year 1968, there had been 200 major anti-war demonstrations involving 400,000 students across 100 campuses. One protest at Columbia University in New York City ended with the arrest of 900 protesters. When Nixon took office in January 1969, negotiations to end the war were not going anywhere. While the negotiations were on hold, Nixon consulted Harry Kissinger, Nixon's security advisor, and they decided on a plan to slowly pull out troops from Vietnam. This plan became known as Vietnamization. While Nixon claimed he opted for the end of U.S. involvement in Vietnam, he ordered a multitude of bombings on supply routes and bases in North Vietnam. Bombings were also carried out in neighboring Laos and Cambodia. In November of 1969, a story surfaced in the New York Times of a massacre in South Vietnam committed by a U.S. platoon. More than 200 innocent Vietnamese villagers, mostly consisting of women, children, and old men, were killed mercilessly. Shortly after Nixon won re-election, peace talks broke off and he launched a final bombing of the North called the Christmas bombings, lasting for 11 days and only stopping on Christmas Day. Christmas bombings called for an end of war by Congress and the Soviet Union and China, who supported the Communist North. Shortly after the United States' departure, the ceasefire ended between the North and South, and fighting resumed. The South called for the U.S. to intervene, but they only stood as North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon. 58,000 U.S. lives were lost in the war, along with 308,000 wounded. Veterans who made it home were faced with hostility and indifference. 15% developed PTSD. The American public took their hatred of the war effort out on the innocent soldiers instead of the politicians. The war divided America and caused arguments between pro-war and anti-war civilians. The distrust in the government also came as a result of the war. After the war, the draft was discontinued and the president's war-making abilities were limited by Congress. The American economy suffered a heavy blow by the Vietnam War. A total of $108 billion spent on the war effort in Vietnam caused widespread inflation in America. In 1973, Congress passed a motion that prohibited U.S. military operation in and over Indochina. Congress also overrode Nixon's veto on an act that would limit his war-making abilities. This was important because Nixon had continued active fighting in Vietnam long after peace talks had begun.